WAKEONE has a reputation in K-pop that few companies could match, for being downright terrible in an oddly specific way. It's no mystery why the "burning WAKEONE's building down" meme is so unanimous among fans of groups under their label. From Kepler to Zerobaseone to IZNA, every project seems plagued by their incompetency. Today, I want to talk about these groups in detail, how WAKEONE has screwed them over, and how Alphadriveone is next on their hit list. So to start, WAKEONE's reputation among K-pop fans is, to put it bluntly, abysmal. So much so that WAKEONE has become synonymous with mismanagement. The company has earned this reputation through a long list of consistent failures. The most obvious is neglect, especially when it comes to proper promotion or support for their artists. Examples of this can be seen through their treatment of all the groups that reside under them: Kepler, Zerobaseone, IZNA, and now soon to debut, Alphadriveone. Things like subpar musical releases, improper choice of title track, aimless concepts and direction, minimal variety appearances, repetitive styling, misuse of members, and bare-bones music videos that look half the budget of their peers. WAKEONE also has a bad habit of treating their temporary groups as if they have the luxury of full 7-year contracts, when in reality, their limited time as a group demands a sense of purpose in their music, concepts, and cohesion through multiple projects. Things that the company consistently fails to show. All of the groups currently under WAKEONE came from survival shows, a trend that has gone on long enough and with enough groups that I can say is most definitely not a coincidence. Survival shows do provide a sizable platform to cultivate fans and popularity ahead of debut, and it seems like WAKEONE believes that this head start alone is enough to carry a group through their contracts. It is not. Survival show groups, at their best, operate under a pressure of an expiration date. This is often the case because the foresight of disbandment forces the company to deliver a complete project during that time, however long their contract is, rather than the random meandering that most K-pop groups resort to after their initial concept and identity runs its course. That built-in timeline leaves no room for aimless experimentation or creative misfires. Groups like Kepler, even with their slightly longer contract, needed that same approach, debuting with a vision and sticking to a plan that evolves naturally over time. But WAKEONE had neither of those. Despite having the support from Mnet's rebooted survival show platform, they somehow walked into Kepler's, Zerobaseone's, and IZNA's debut with no long-term story, no cohesive sound, and no clear understanding of what they wanted the groups to represent. Although, for clarity's sake, I should bring up that IZNA is WAKEONE's first permanent group and is also managed by the Black Label. Not that it makes what they're doing to them any better, but, you know. Originally, I only planned for this video to be a comparison of two groups, Kepler and Zerobaseone, for reasons I think are quite obvious. Both were formed through Mnet survival shows, that being Girls Planet 999 and Boys Planet. Both are managed by WAKEONE, and yet their careers have taken drastically different paths in terms of public perception, album sales, and chart performance. IZNA's inclusion came later after they released their second mini-album, Not Just Pretty. That is when I realized that this was bigger than just two groups. This was a company-wide issue, one that will follow the recently announced new boy group, Alphadriveone as well. That group name, by the way, still unserious to this day. To best understand my issues and anyone else's who happens to be a fan of these four groups, it's best that we do this piece by piece. Starting with Kepler. Kepler is a girl group created by CJ Entertainment through Mnet's 2021 reality competition show Girls Planet 999. The group made their debut on January 3rd, 2022, originally managed jointly by WAKEONE and Swing Entertainment. After a company reorganization on September 30th, 2024, Clap Entertainment joined WAKEONE in overseeing the group's activities. The group consists of 7 members: Kim Chaehyun, Hyunning Bahye, Choi Yoojin, Kim Dayeon, So Youngun, Izaki Hikaru, and Shen Xiaoteng. Originally a 9-piece ensemble, former members Kang Yeso and Sakamoto Mashiro departed from the group in July of 2024. From the very start, Kepler's formation was something the public watched with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Coming so soon after the produce rigging scandal and Mnet's public promise that they would never produce another survival show again, the announcement of Girls Planet felt suspicious. Back in December of 2019, Kang Ji-hyun, Mnet's content operations manager, had clearly stated that the network would no longer create audition programs. But on January 11th, 2021, not even 2 years later from that statement, Mnet officially announced Girls Planet, breaking that promise and reigniting public doubt. The atmosphere surrounding the show was uncertain. Viewers questioned how it would differ from Produce, what safeguards would be put in place to prevent another rigging scandal, and whether Mnet could truly be trusted again. Some even wondered if the network might use subtler manipulation this time to assemble their preferred lineup. And perhaps most importantly, even if a group managed to debut from this chaos, would anyone genuinely support them? The answers to these questions turned out to be quite mixed. Girls Planet was in no practical way different from the Produce series, and while Mnet claimed to have learned from their past controversy, even outsourcing the vote counting, which now included international fans, their grip on the show's outcome was still painfully obvious. Through manipulative editing choices, Mnet shaped the narrative to their liking. Evil edits cast Chinese contestants as antagonists, Angel edits framed Korean trainees as protagonists, and Japanese contestants were basically non-existent. Trainees like Tsai Bing, Fu Yaning, and Su Rui-chi, who initially gained attention and support, became some of the clearest examples of how Mnet's selective storytelling could destroy contestants' images overnight. Another source of contention was the cell systems, a method that was originally implemented to preserve an even 3:3:3 ratio of Chinese, Korean, and Japanese trainees led to improper placement. Less talented trainees could be carried by their partners into safe positions and vice versa. Talented trainees could be dragged down by their teammates and unfairly eliminated. Perhaps foreseeing this outcome, a save option was available to the judges of the show. At each elimination, judges could save a trainee to save based on their merit. A controversial move given that the public opinion rarely agreed with the judges' assessment of who deserved to stay. The facade of a fair competition died rather quickly, which makes it no surprise that when the final lineup was eventually announced, many had issues with who got in, who didn't, and the sought-after center position. Truth be told, I did not watch Girls Planet, and after consulting a few fans of Kep1er who helped with the research of this video, they adamantly advised me not to. However, it's clear from archived posts on Twitter, Reddit, TikTok, and other social media posts that people were not fans of the lineup. Controversies included Xiaoting being the only Chinese contestant to debut, her dropping all the way to 9th place after the final vote weight adjustment between Korean and international votes, Bora, a Japanese contestant, being excluded, leaving the group without a clear main vocalist other than Chaehyun, and Bahye placing 2nd, or even debuting at all, according to some people. And finally, Chaehyun securing the center spot. The promise of a truly global girl group also fell short, with the final lineup consisting of 6 Korean trainees, 1 Chinese trainee, and 2 Japanese trainees. Some of these concerns are self-explanatory, but one in particular deserves attention because of its lasting impact on the group: Hyuning Bahye. As mentioned earlier, many fans were unhappy about her debut in Kep1er. From what I've gathered, it's less about a lack of talent and more about the perception that other contestants were more deserving of the spot. Still, finishing 2nd in the competition is no mistake, and Bahye gained a strong, loyal fanbase through her time on Girls Planet, who defended her fiercely. And of course, situations like her aren't unusual in survival shows. I've seen similar dynamics in Boys Planet and Island 2. What makes Kep1er different, however, is the intensity of the division within their fandom. Solo stans and fans who favor certain members over others are common in groups formed from survival shows. Hell, they're common even in normal groups. But I've never seen a fanbase as split as Kep1er's. On any platform, you could find factions campaigning for Bahye to go solo, to be kicked out of the group, or to be excluded whenever possible. In some ways, it's hard not to point to this internal division as a part of the reason behind Kep1er's struggles. I mean, truly, who needs antis when you have fans like these? And so, turning a group around under circumstances like Kep1er's would have been no small feat. Under more competent management, it's easy to imagine a version of Kep1er flourishing. But once they fell under WAKEONE's control, the odds of major success were slim, and whatever optimism remained evaporated with their debut, First Impact. Admittedly, as I listened through their discography for this video, I struggled to understand why Kepler had earned such a negative reputation. I mean, sure, Wadada wasn't a groundbreaking debut, but in my opinion, it didn't deserve the backlash that followed. With input from Kepler fans, it became clear that much of the criticism stemmed from unmet expectations. Debuts from survival show groups often hit hard, whether musically, conceptually, or narratively, and fans expected Kepler to follow in the steps of their predecessors. Instead, Wadada was a generic track. There's no better way to put it. Its references to the group's space concept were minimal, and by that point the theme had already been overused, leaving the song with little to distinguish Kepler from their contemporaries. To make matters worse, a B-side, Mask, was favored much more by fans, showing the first instance of WAKEONE's poor decision-making when it comes to title tracks. A habit I will be sure to mention from this point forward. In short, the debut wasn't bad per se, but it failed to carve out a unique identity, or showcase what made the group special to those who hadn't watched Girls Planet. The one chance that WAKEONE had to appeal to the general public came and went, just like that. As sad as it is to say, First Impact was Kepler's commercial peak. That already confusing start became even more muddled with Kepler's first comeback, Do Blast. Up, the title track, was received much more warmly by fans, but it did little to address the growing questions around Kepler's identity. Musically, it was a complete shift, from the EDM and big house sound of their debut to a funky, cutesy track, a disparity mirrored across the project as a whole. It became painfully clear that WAKEONE had no long-term plan for the group beyond releasing relatively safe, digestible music that might appeal in the short term, but did nothing to establish a clear artistic or conceptual direction. It came across that WAKEONE was releasing music simply for the sake of releasing music. But what truly cemented Kepler's outcast status in K-pop was WeFresh. Troublemaker was yet another shift that reflected none of the projects that came before it, and if anything seemed to decrease in quality. WeFresh was the first song I genuinely didn't like when combing through their discography, and if the numbers are anything to go by, it seemed as though the general public and fans alike agreed. Troublemaker is where Kepler truly fell off. I'm, of course, using that term relatively, as Kepler to this day has continued to sell about 100,000 albums per comeback. All of the comebacks that followed made little to no noise, a sign that most casual listeners had run out of patience, and that even some of Kepler's core fanbase lost hope of a revival. But to give the group some credit, their more recent comebacks have shown a noticeable sense of direction, musically and conceptually. I would even go as far to say that their Japanese discography, which I didn't really talk about, is better than their Korean one. The problem with this recently discovered image of Kepler is twofold. First, this clarity was not due to a sudden change of heart in WAKEONE's management, but rather the lack thereof. The reason that Kepler finally came around to a firm identity was because they were no longer under WAKEONE, but rather Clap Entertainment. This is the result of the reorganization I mentioned in their intro. Although it is technically a joint management of the group, their responsibilities are split between the physical management of schedules and promotion and the creative side of their operation. WAKEONE has continued to manage Kepler's activities, but when it comes to their musical output, Clap Entertainment is in charge of it. Secondly, this eventual turnaround is just a little too late. The damage to their reputation has already been done. At this point, Kepler's standing feels anchored as an outlier. Even if they were to deliver flawless comebacks from here on out, it likely wouldn't change much. In K-pop, once a group is deemed irrelevant, there's very little that can change that perception. You could still grow artistically and maintain a loyal fanbase, as they have, but recapturing that initial peak is almost impossible, which may be why they've decided to extend their contracts. While not all of the companies involved extended their idols' tenure with WAKEONE, it is safe to say that the ones who did saw them as more valuable as a group than separately. It's an easy answer for why Kepler is the first Mnet group to extend their contracts, whereas a more beloved group like IZNA did not. But of course, this fall-off is not unique to Kepler. It's just the life cycle of how pop music works. No artist stays at the top forever, and fading from the spotlight isn't a failure. It's quite natural. Still, it's hard not to feel bad that Kepler's peak, both commercially and publicly, arriving right at debut, is a special, bitter kind of irony. Now, it's safe to say that Kep1er has never been particularly well regarded by the wider K-pop community, largely to do with how poorly the career has been handled by their management. Between underwhelming comebacks, weak promotion, and questionable decisions like their mishandled appearance on Queendom 2, which immediately stalled their early momentum, Kep1er's path has often been more defined by their company's mistakes than by their own efforts or potential. Zerobaseone is a boy group created through Mnet's survival program Boys Planet, and is currently managed by WAKEONE Entertainment. They officially debuted on July 10th, 2023. The lineup is made up of 9 members: Kim Ji-young, Jang Hao, Sang Han-bin, Sok Matthew, Kim Tae-rae, Ricky, Kim Gyuvin, Park Gun-wook, and Han Yoo-jin. Starting from pre-debut, Boys Planet removed many of the more controversial aspects of Girls Planet, but as a result, it became almost indistinguishable from the produced series that came before it. They got rid of the infamous cell system and eliminated the Planet Pass. And instead of dividing contestants into Korean, Japanese, and Chinese groups, Boys Planet simplified the format into 2 main divisions: K Group, which consisted of Korean trainees, and G Group, consisting of global trainees. This streamlining of contestants, while easier to digest, also felt a lot like erasure. Anyone who wasn't Korean, whether Chinese, Japanese, American, Thai, or otherwise, was shoved into a single global category, lumped together regardless of their background. The number disparity between the 2 groups was telling, and it wasn't long before fans noticed what kind of treatment the global contestants were getting. It was very similar to the othering that happened to Japanese and Chinese contestants in Girls Planet. Once again, the show's editing weaponized narrative manipulation to shape the lineup. Even some of the debuting members weren't immune to this treatment. Sok Matthew and Ricky, for instance, both received unfavorable edits early on. Ricky as cold and detached, and Matthew as greedy and entitled. Still, by the end of the program, the outlook on this potential group was much more optimistic. While there was grudges held over the final lineup, as there always are, most people were satisfied with the end result. Zerobaseone has generally enjoyed a good reputation from the K-pop community, but their career hasn't been free from criticism, most of which circles back to their management. The group debuted to a much warmer reception than that of Kep1er, which may have to do more with a slightly better choice of title track than any intentional changes made by the company. However, what doesn't get discussed as much, and what I really want to pay attention to in this video, is how equally fragmented Zerobaseone's discography has been. The main criticism of Kep1er when it comes to their career has been the jumping around from concept to concept in their discography. Zerobaseone, much the same, has jumped from In Bloom to Crush and then to Feel the Pop. These radical changes in music and sound show the same lack of musical coherence, conceptual focus, or even a stable artistic identity that plagued Kep1er's early work. Each comeback feels like a soft reboot rather than a continuation or established identity. The one thing that changed when it came to Zerobaseone in opposition to Kep1er is the fact that despite doing the same thing functionally, WAKEONE tried to kinda cover their tracks a little bit this time. But before getting ahead of myself, let me address their debut. Since I want to continue the trend of comparing and contrasting Zerobaseone and Kep1er, I'll do so based on their title tracks. At least Wadada tried to tie back to the Girls Planet space motif, even if only symbolically. Zerobaseone's In Bloom didn't even bother with that. It just existed in its own floral universe with no contextual bridges to the show that birthed them. Which, to be clear, I don't think that there was any statement put forward or expectation that Zerobaseone had to carry over the theme of Boys Planet, but I think that a lot of people got that kind of idea because of their name. Zerobaseone. It still feels very space-oriented. Since then, their concepts have only drifted further apart, going from youthful pop to EDM-influenced anthems to tropical summer tracks. Much like Kep1er, it's not that these songs are bad on their own standing, it's just that they don't form a cohesive story. Despite all that, Zerobaseone hasn't faced nearly as much scrutiny for their musical inconsistency. Part of that is because fans and critics tend to discuss them through lens of anything other than music. Their origins, the members, the visuals, the group dynamics, shipping, memes, etc. And honestly, that is a shame. Because while I do think that their musical direction is aimless, I do think that there's merit in the music itself. So in the spirit of that, this is where I kind of step in and dissect in more detail all of their comebacks. Starting with their debut, In Bloom, from Youth in the Shade, builds itself on a bright, fast-paced electropop sound while lyrically exploring the evergreen topic of love. It is a debut track that leans on the language of growth and vitality, so it should come as no surprise that it has a lot of flowers, clean imagery, and freshness. Yes, I'm still annoyed with that. The music video is pretty uneventful for the most part until the random 8-bit video game visual halfway through. If I'm being honest with myself, when I was watching it for the first time, I immediately thought of IZNA, and I literally just think that's because of the flowers. And honestly, when the thought came to mind that WAKEONE might be, drawing inspiration from a super popular survival show group, I wasn't really surprised, considering how lazy they are. I assume they're ready to reuse concepts from someone else's playbook at any time. In Bloom does play it relatively safe though, clinging to a formula that has already proven popular with audiences from previous Mnet survival show alumni. And then came their first comeback, Melting Point, and with it, Crush. This release marked a complete 180 from In Bloom. The sonic shift into a darker, more conventional sound and look for a boy group was unexpected. Crush draws from EDM and Jersey Club influences, aligning itself more closely with the performance-heavy ad-lib haven that defines much of 4th-gen boy group music. I know that specifically when this title track was released, it did get criticism from the fan base, especially because it seemed like Zerobaseone were starting off on a really good foot and then completely diverging to what was honestly expected of most boy groups nowadays. To be clear, I personally liked it, and I've said before how In Bloom and Crush are my favorite title tracks from Zerobaseone, despite how different they are. I do have to agree with the fact that completely throwing away the debut concept and immediately turning into what Crush is really jarring. And while many could describe this shift as versatility, as I imagine you could describe any concept change really, it doesn't come across that way to most people because your identity was just established. Like, you need to play around in that arena a little bit before immediately diving into something else. But also, take note that the mini-album Melting Point is still very reminiscent of their debut concept and sound, and that only the title track bears a deviation from it, which makes it even stranger. After that, we have Feel the Pop, the title track from You Had Me at Hello. This release threw yet another curveball at us, ones that we are seemingly getting one after another after another. I wonder if that sounds familiar. Feel the Pop is a glossy, tacky, my opinion, pop track that leans into bright synths and bubblegum tones, but offers little in terms of depth. The most distinctive feature of this comeback was the music video, which is something you never want to hear about an artist. The music video is a fever dream assembled from what I can only imagine is the director's latest acid trip. Office workers, cowboys, tennis courts, and city life, I guess. To this day, I have no fucking clue what this music video is. The concept of Feel the Pop is everything and nothing at the same time. A visual fever dream held together by hopes and dreams. Oh, and also by some ass shaking. I feel like if I don't mention that, some Zeroses might kill me, so there you go. And those are the first 3 releases when discussing Zerobaseone's discography. As a fan, I'll admit, I just didn't realize how these releases clashed together when experienced back-to-back with no transitional period or explanation. And to be clear, I don't mean that these albums are bad. I've talked at length how much I love In Bloom and Crush, how Melting Point was my favorite mini-album from them for a period of time, and how You Had Me at Hello is, well, a mess. None of this is new. But I think, maybe naively, I assumed the group's lack of cohesion came from a reluctance to fully commit to their lighter concept. If I were to describe what sets Zerobaseone apart from other boy groups today, I would say it's their willingness to diverge from what is expected. While there are always exceptions, most boy groups tend to repeat the same familiar images. Sexy concepts, rebellious concepts, loud EDM, or noise music. Zerobaseone, on the other hand, stands out by leaning into a kind of boy next door appeal. Something that was popular before 4th gen and is kind of having a resurgence now. And if I may be so bold to say, I do believe that Zerobaseone had a hand in repopularizing it. Yet, despite the clear success Zerobaseone has found doing this, it seems as though WAKEONE has an almost compulsive tendency to conform to what was popular at one point in time. Take their 3rd mini-album, You Had Me at Hello. As I've said before, I'm not the biggest fan of this release. And it doesn't seem others were either, given that this was their biggest drop off numbers-wise. It's easily their weakest project to date, plagued by inconsistency and a complete unwillingness to commit to any particular sound or concept. It features what I would consider their worst song so far, Solar Power, an intro hip-hop abomination. The album then jumps from bubblegum pop, their title track, to R&B, to house, to more generic pop, and then lands on a ballad, before crippling back to a sped-up version of the same tired title track, not to mention the ever-present misstep of title track selection. It's obvious by now that I don't have a lot of love for Feel the Pop, but in reality, I would probably like it a lot more as a B-side, and if there wasn't a much more viable option on the same release perfect for the position. Sweat. The opinion that Sweat should have been the title track instead of the pre-release is opinion held by a majority of the fanbase, given how much more suited the members are for it being the perfect summer track, and it's much more representative of the album's rollout and aesthetic. And, in my very biased opinion, just a straight-up better song. But more than anything, You Had Me at Hello had that same stubbornness for integrating more powerful and rougher songs, a direction that I don't think fits ZB1 to this day. You Had Me at Hello was the culmination of WAKEONE's biggest farce so far. So I mentioned before how, as opposed to Kep1er, Zerobaseone had a sort of way of falsely creating a kind of continuity between their albums, and this is absolutely present when we consider the first 3 releases. And predictably, it doesn't have anything to do with what's actually in the album or represented by the stages, concept, styling, the whole look, right? It has everything to do with the album covers. So something that people realized pretty quickly was that the album covers for Youth in the Shade, Melting Point, and the pre-release song Sweat were all super zoomed in. Now, when this was actually pointed out and people were putting pieces together, this was originally played for a kind of a joke, right? Like, this was probably just a mistake that happened. Except when You Had Me at Hello actually came out and people saw the album cover, they were like, that kinda looks familiar. And yes, the continuity that WAKEONE was just kind of shoving in there without working to actually make a reality was just the zoomed in letters of the actual albums to make up what would be their 3rd mini album. But after this point, it seems like even that was too much. The fake continuity that WAKEONE tries to instill in Zerobaseone from this point forward only shows its face in one other place. The releases that follow You Had Me at Hello were Cinema Paradise and Blue Paradise. The only thread binding these 2 projects together is that they're both Paradise. But those are 2 projects that I will not be dissecting in this video. For the sake of consistency, I will only be talking about the first 3 mini-albums of Zerobaseone as I did with Kep1er. I could go more in depth into these 2 groups' discographies to further illustrate my point, but honestly, I've already done so through the first 3 mini-albums, and continuing this line of thought would only be redundant. But before moving on to IZNA, I do want to wrap up this train of thought, specifically the gap between Kep1er and Zerobaseone, despite their strikingly similar struggles. Like I alluded to before, I do believe that Zerobaseone's better reputation within the community and all-around better reception has much to do with the fact that a lot of the people who interact with Zerobaseone and their music and their whole brand do so without prioritizing their music. I honestly believe that this is why Zerobaseone has had a more successful time as a group than Kep1er ever did. One of the things I briefly mentioned was shipping, and that is undeniably a big part of the Zerobaseone fandom. And honestly, you can feel however you want to feel about this specific topic. I honestly don't really care that much. As with all things, as long as there are lines drawn in the sand, I really don't give a shit what you do. I only start caring about that kind of stuff when it crosses a line, when the silly nonsense that people do online crosses the threshold and people start believing that it's actually real. Anyway, my point being is that shipping done by the community is often done because of the fan service that Zerobaseone presents throughout all of their content, whether that be YouTube videos, concerts, TikToks, etc. I am also not going to sit here and try to admonish a group for using whatever ways they can to market themselves and appeal to an audience. Obviously, it's very effective, and it is far from the only tool that Zerobaseone has employed to improve their lot. But there is also a small part of it that actually has nothing to do with them. Now, I've griped on and on about how similar these two groups are, but I've been missing a very important and integral part of what makes them different and what makes the K-pop community treat them different. And that has to do with the very obvious fact that Kep1er is a girl group and Zerobaseone is a boy group. When it comes to the differences in K-pop fandom culture, the tried and true belief that girl groups work to garner casual listeners and boy groups work to garner and expand a loyal fan base remains true. And it is certainly the explanation for the differences between Kep1er and Zerobaseone's reception. And before I go on to say what I'm about to say, I do want to stress the fact that I am a Zeros. I am a fan of Zerobaseone, and it is because of that that I can confidently say a big part of Zerobaseone's appeal doesn't lie in their music. To be clear, I am not saying that their music is bad and has no impact, or any other diminishing adjective that you can tack on here. All I'm saying right now is that it's not the main reason that people tune into them. Honestly, that could be said about a lot of boy groups. As much as it pains me to say, I am self-aware enough to realize that if Zerobaseone was compromised of female idols, the results would not be the same. Zerobaseone is one of the best groups I've personally seen when it comes to fan service. I've made a video in the past talking about K-pop pairings and their implications, and Zerobaseone utilizes this best when it comes to facilitating fan interaction and retaining fans. Generally, boy groups are more prone to relying on this tactic. Girl groups can as well, but the results are varied and not as effective. This is admittedly from my own observations, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. There is also another element of this. K-pop fans tend to come down harsher on girl groups than they do on boy groups. I've already explained at length already that both Zerobaseone and Kep1er have issues with musical cohesiveness. If you haven't got it by now, I don't know what to tell you. But I am far from the first person to point this out. It's pretty well known and accepted that this is the case. And so it really just comes down to the fact that boy groups are more easily forgiven for this kind of misstep. Whereas if a girl group releases one project that isn't like a smash hit, immediately they fell off, they're not relevant anymore, or any other diminishing adjectives you can just tack onto there. And so, with this really inspiring pep talk, it's finally time to talk about IZNA. IZNA is a 6-member girl group under WAKEONE Entertainment and the Black Label, with production led by Teddy Park. Formed through Mnet's survival program, Island 2, the group officially debuted on November 25th, 2024. Originally consisting of 7 members, Mai, Bang Jimin, Coco, Ru Sarang, Choi Jungin, Jung Sebi, and Yoon Ji-yoon. The group became 6 after Ji-yoon's departure. IZNA was formed through the survival show Island 2, which has a much different setup compared to the other 2 survival shows that we've discussed so far. Island 2 is the female sequel to Island, the show that ended up forming ENHYPEN. As such, the 2 share a lot of the same structural guidelines for how they function. Island 2 is split into 2 parts. The first half of the show is considered to be team-focused, highlighting the contestants' abilities to perform their roles well, and to the betterment of the group. The deciding factor for whether the 24 participating contestants would go on to the second part of the show was contingent on the judges' choices and the votes of the trainees themselves. Island 2 was comprised of challenges, which would encompass each episode. And within each episode, it was decided whether or not the contestants would end up in Island or Ground. Both of these were living spaces, but with much different facilities to each of them. Island being more decked out, and Ground only supplying the bare minimum. The whole reason for implementing this part of the survival show was to encourage the contestants to bring out the best of themselves, which it often did not. There was also the added stressor that if you were in ground long enough and performed poorly enough, that you would eventually be eliminated. During the second half of the show, where the trainees were judged more on their individual skill and popularity, their fates were decided by the judges' choice and audience participation through voting. When it comes to the common survival show pitfalls, however, Island 2 suffers from much the same issues. Uncharitable edits, dramatized moments, harsh, unproductive criticism, heavily biased feedback from judges, and heavier focus on popularity or stage presence than substantial skill. What was uniquely observed about this show as it was airing, and by myself as well, centers on the trainees themselves. While it's common for a show of this nature to have certain participants that are lacking in some respect, whether that's singing, rapping, or dancing, Island 2 was special for having none of the trainees on it be vocally exceptional. Like, zero, zilch, nada. While there was some number of decent vocalists, like Fuko or Jiyoon, among others, it became obvious within the first episode's audition portion that none of the potential idols we were seeing were main vocalist worthy. This might not sound surprising given the trend of idol shows and fans alike prioritizing vocal skill less and less, but it was still a shock to find no exceptionally talented vocal trainees. And in a normal survival show, the fact that some of these contestants weren't necessarily the best at singing, they would at least be exceptional in some other way, whether that's rapping or dancing, but it was personally shocking for me watching this show while it was airing to find that there were some trainees on this show that shouldn't have been there at all. Like, I don't want to be mean, but there were definitely some trainees who were there just because of their visuals. There were some trainees on this show that straight up weren't good singers, weren't good rappers, they couldn't even really dance that well, and they didn't really have good stage presence beyond the fact that they were pretty. And listen, this isn't new. Survival shows have always had what people would call dozens. But this was my first time, first of all, watching a survival show all the way through while it was airing, but also realizing that most of the contestants were dozens. From my understanding of other people watching survival shows, dozens tend to be a part of survival shows, but they never really are the majority, whereas I would say that was definitely the case with Island 2. And so because of this, it was very obvious to tell who was going to be part of the lineup because they were the people with the actual skills to back it up. So much so that, with this knowledge and my own personal observations about how much screen time the show was giving certain contestants, it was quite obvious which of the trainees would end up in the final lineup. At the beginning of Island 2, it was announced that this show would form a group consisting of 6 members. Now, a lot of viewers, just from the outset, called bullshit, mostly because Enhypen, the group that preceded IZNA, ended up being 7 members. So a lot of people correctly assumed that it would be a surprise on the final ranking when they added an additional member. When the episode finally came around, the first 5 members were introduced based on their ranking. The 6th member ended up being chosen by the judges. And then, surprise, surprise, there ended up being an additional 7th member, who was also chosen by the judges. These 2 members ended up being Sebi and Mai. Now, this actually ended up causing a lot of controversy at the time because prior to this episode, the audience was not aware of the fact that 2 of the positions were going to be chosen by the judges. It was also very unclear what criteria the judges were using to choose these contestants. But with hindsight, 20/20 vision, I honestly think the judges made the right choice. Now, I know I was just talking about how I didn't like how the show prioritized visuals and everything, but I do think that when it comes to stan attractors or stage presence, Sebi and Mai are vital to IZNA. The rest of the 5 members, while being very skilled in, the technical aspects, Coco with her rapping and dancing, Sarang with her dancing and vocals, Jiyoon and Jungin both being lead vocal material, and Jimin having a lot of center potential. While these 5 girls were really good picks, I do think that they were missing something very integral to K-pop, something that Sebi and Mai both have. And as annoying as this might sound, I do think that these 2 in particular do have star power, something that's very integral, innate, and you can't really learn. All around though, I do think IZNA is a really well-made group. which really just makes it so much sadder that they ended up being under WAKEONE permanently. And with that being said, let's get to the debut. The mini-album in question, NA, was comprised largely out of reworked songs from Island 2 with 2 original additions, the self-titled title track IZNA and a new B-side, Time Bomb. And it is one of the weakest introductions I've seen to a group. IZNA, the song, sets an unfortunately accurate tone to what is ahead of IZNA, a reoccurring trend that extends past just this project. Outdated production and a criminally understated misuse of the members' talents make it one of the most disappointing debuts in recent memory. The song and the initial concept it sets up for the group feels recycled from other 3rd and maybe 4th gen acts, who, frankly, did it better, and have already abandoned this trope for more interesting territory. There's little identity to grasp onto in this debut, and as I've mentioned, many of the members blend together without distinct tone or texture. Save an exception for Jiyoon, but that wouldn't last as she would go on hiatus not long after. For a debut that should introduce IZNA as who they are as a group, NA feels instead like a generic imitation of what was popular 5 years ago. That said, the B-sides salvage this from being a total disaster. Time Bomb in particular stands out as the album's strongest moment, but it suffers from a much too similar issue as the remaining tracks. Instead of being derivative of older songs, Time Bomb is derivative of newer 5th gen songs. It's hard to overlook how much of a missed opportunity NA feels like. In an industry as competitive as K-pop, it was absolutely the wrong move to make. In my opinion, the worst offense that you can make during a debut is being boring. Even having a debut that is divisive, or seen as bad from a majority of people has more benefit than being plain unmemorable. Obviously, things have changed since then, but the debut I will always refer to as an example is NMIXX's OO. I've made videos about them as a group citing my initial rejection of their sound, but my slow and gradual appreciation that was born from their individuality. As divisive as their debut was, people knew them. The song stuck with them. You know who they were and what they would make. The same can't be said for IZNA, a debut so mediocre and unmemorable that the hype that preceded them quickly fizzled out. I wonder why that sounds so familiar. Compared to their debut, Sign, their first comeback, the digital single that followed had a much better reception. Sign is a synth pop track that depicted IZNA with a love-struck concept amid a potential relationship. There was, of course, the ever-present criticism of an older sound that follows all of Teddy's production, but Sign happened to hit a perfect balance of nostalgia and modernity. A sound that was the closest to what was advertised on Island 2. It was familiar enough to the show's most popular song, I Will Always Love You, without being a straight-up copy. It got love from fans and casual listeners alike, so much so that there was a persistent narrative online that this was the direction IZNA should go in. It was non-specific enough to be broadly appealing, but it also fit into its own nostalgic niche to not be considered redundant or derivative of groups past or present. And then came Beep, yet another digital single. A UK garage dance track that centered on a similar love-struck ambiance, just now more excited about the potential relationship. Not as loved as Sign, but definitely an improvement over IZNA. While Beep doesn't really fall into the pitfall of being another outdated Teddy track, it was criticized this time for being really repetitive. Another track whose whole chorus is just the title being singed over and over again. Still, even for how nondescript Beep is, it is a marketable improvement over IZNA, and not that much of a deviation from Sign. I know that I personally saw it as a hopeful sign, no pun intended, about the new direction IZNA would continue down. Both of these releases were done with Jiyoon on hiatus, a move that was seen by a majority of fans as optimistic. Given that these were not physical full comebacks and only singles, it was entirely possible that WAKEONE was simply biding time until Jiyoon could return, re-record 2 songs, and carry on with the group. Unfortunately for us, Jiyoon's departure was finalized on August 19th, 2025. It didn't take long for IZNA's second mini-album to be announced, and when I say not long, I mean insanely soon. barely 2.5 weeks later. That is an incredibly short turnaround time for any group, let alone one that just lost a member. Realistically, though, it's more likely that WAKEONE had known about Jiyoon's exit long before and chose to make it public only when the comeback was already planned, hoping to soften the blow and redirect fans' frustrations toward excitement for new music. But it's with this newest release, not just Pretty, that WAKEONE's handling of their group starts to feel less like simple incompetence and more like intentional sabotage. Let's start with the most glaring part of this comeback, the title track. Mamma Mia has been the center of endless debate for fans, not just for what it says about IZNA's direction, but also for what it exposes about WAKEONE's chronic inability to pick the right title track. Personally, I don't hate the song as much as other people do, but there's no denying that it is easily the weakest on the entire album. And that's not because it's poorly made, but because it sounds unfinished. Mamma Mia sounds like a bare-bones demo. It literally sounds like it's missing foundational parts of a song to make it sound complete. The biggest point of contention is the chorus. It drops out to nothing but the beat and some loose, talking, shouting vocal delivery of the lyrics, a convention that's become the norm in the past year. This might have worked if there was any real instrumentation to fill that space, but there isn't. It's just empty. The verses aren't great either, but they hold together better by comparison. The pre-choruses are a saving grace of Mamma Mia, as they are in most IZNA songs. It is certainly no coincidence that the best part of Mamma Mia comes from the portion with literally anything tangible going on, the dance break. This section doesn't have any lyrics or melody, yet it's much more interesting musically compared to any other part of the song. This part also serves as IZNA's opportunity to show off performance-wise with an intense choreography, one that they've definitely pulled off when it comes to their music stages. However, none of this is able to save a song so lackluster of personality that it fails to deliver the image that WAKEONE was obviously aiming for with the styling and music video. A dark, badass, even girl crush image, which is made even more confusing when you finally listen to the rest of the mini-album. Surrounded by upbeat, love-adjacent songs like Super Crush, Race Car, and an even softer one like In the Rain, Mamma Mia fails at representing IZNA's newest project beyond the latest superficial image switch that WAKEONE wanted IZNA to do for this comeback. A better title track to represent the mini-album that we did get would have been Race Car. Again, another sonically interesting song made victim by WAKEONE's obsession with mediocrity. But the biggest question I was left with was why? Why the sudden image change? I assumed WAKEONE realized that the overdone, braggadocious image of their debut was not doing well, so the switch to something else made sense. But after getting love for the love-struck concept, the change to yet another unrelated image made no sense. Until I reflected on WAKEONE's track record as a whole. To conclude, what we've learned from Kep1er and Zerobaseone is to learn what WAKEONE has not. WAKEONE has an insistence of never creating a narrative for their groups that extend beyond a singular comeback, or even to the rest of the tracks on that given release. A weakness WAKEONE couldn't explain when it came to their other two groups, but have found a scapegoat for when it comes to IZNA. When IZNA was formed, they were described with this motto: anytime, anywhere, anything is me. A simple phrase that means exactly what you think it means. Anything that IZNA does is IZNA. No explanation needed. WAKEONE can now hide behind this anytime someone questions what the hell they're doing with this group. Oh, IZNA is doing an arrogant concept? That's IZNA. Oh, they switched to a love-struck concept? Still IZNA. What about the latest comeback? What about the girl crush adjacent image? Nah, that's IZNA too. Although they've never explicitly said it with Kep1er or Zerobaseone, they're also built on this ambiguity. It doesn't matter that Kep1er, Zerobaseone, or IZNA doesn't have concepts or directions, that ambiguity is their concept. I hate it here. And finally, we arrive at Alphadriveone, WAKEONE's newest group and the latest product of Mnet's unending survival show assembly line. A group that I have nothing to musically dissect or analyze, purely because they haven't officially debuted yet. They are the product of Boys Planet 2, the sequel to Boys Planet, and are therefore following in Zerobaseone's footsteps. Trust that it is not lost on me that Boys Planet 2 came out before Girls Planet 2. I don't even think there will be a Girls Planet 2, but Watch me eat my words, it's happened before. Regardless, it's a decision that speaks volumes. To state the obvious, Mnet saw the measurable gap between Kepler and Zerobaseone and didn't even bother with the facade. They just went back to the cash cow that proved its worth. While I did not watch Boys Planet 2, my heart nor my patience could handle another survival show after Island 2, I have heard horror stories. Sadly, none of them are new. More evil edits, more exploitation of contestants, more unfair treatment toward foreign trainees, and apparently a lot of extreme diet culture is included in that as well. You get the idea. Unfortunately, I don't think watching it would have given me any more insight into the workings of these types of shows more than the past 3 I have already discussed. Instead, I want to conclude this video blind. Purely based on the actions of WAKEONE over the past 4 years, I want to try predicting what will happen to Alphadriveone without knowing anything about them, because, as I've explained, the idols themselves have nothing to do with whether they'll be successful, especially when it comes to WAKEONE. If skill, merit, or work ethic of any individual idol could make a sizable difference in their group's prospects, I believe that we would have seen that with Kepler. One thing I can adamantly attest to is that skill was not the determining factor in why Zerobaseone succeeded where Kepler failed. Honestly, I wish I could interject some kind of suspense in this last section, but there isn't any. We've already seen how this story plays out. 3 times, actually. Kepler was the first to expose WAKEONE's weaknesses. Zerobaseone, for all their popularity, only served WAKEONE on how to disguise the problem better. And IZNA only confirmed everyone's worst fears that the fundamental issues of WAKEONE aren't accidental, but institutional. You know what they say, 3 times is a pattern, and Alphadriveone won't be immune to it. Their 5-year contract, one that is longer than any survival show group before them that wasn't permanent, just means 5 years of rotational aesthetics. A carousel of whatever everybody else is doing that happens to be popular. And that is if they are lucky. I believe that if Alphadriveone follows Zerobaseone's path to the letter, which I imagine they will since it proved to be lucrative, I think that they will have decent, but perhaps not the same exact results. Even if Alphadriveone debuts strong, with a sound that is relatively safe but not painfully generic, I just can't see how WAKEONE strikes gold twice using the same predictable formula. As uncreative as they are, I don't think they're naive enough to believe that they can replicate the same success without backlash. And much like IZNA after Island 2, Alphadriveone won't be starting on a blank slate. They'll inherit the debris of every past experiment. The fan fatigue, the brand distrust, unreliable concepts and trailers. Hell, I won't even be surprised if they repeat the cycle of having one excluded foreign member who's constantly shafted. I don't know why, but it seems like WAKEONE has a quota that they need to hit for at least one member to be constantly pushed to the sidelines. And honestly, I didn't even talk about the mistreatment that WAKEONE does to their idols. I purposely kept this video focused on the music because that's what I personally wanted to talk about, but I hope no one gets the implication that I don't know or don't care that WAKEONE is horrible on a more fundamental level. Like a lot of K-pop companies, they just don't see their idols as people, as human beings. And that is WAKEONE's tragedy. I have no doubt that the members of Alphadriveone will try their damnedest to work hard, but unfortunately the outcome was written long before they even debuted, long before they even got on Boys Planet 2. Alphadriveone doesn't even need to release a single song for us to know what's coming. And again, I really want to harp on the fact that WAKEONE is the crucial aspect that keeps failing with every single group. And while I don't generally speak positively about survival shows and the like, I will say that in this instance, Mnet has done their job successfully. Every survival show I talked about, Girls Planet, Boys Planet, Island 2, the pattern is painfully consistent. The talent is there, the ambition is there, and none of it matters when the company they reside in fumbles them over and over and over again. These shows did their job. They were able to give these trainees a platform, a head start, a fan base to lean on in their future activities. And each of these prospective groups went into debut with so much hype, and each time it's trampled over. WAKEONE is consistently killing their group's momentum the second they officially debut. And that's all I really had to say. Feel free to comment below if you have any more information that I didn't happen to include in this video. Like I said, this is like the longest video I've done so far, but I feel like even then I may have missed out on a few things. Feel free to correct me, feel free to add to the long array of WAKEONE's mistakes. Anyway, that'll be it from me for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye!